Hello and welcome back to Starmergeddon, TLDR's premier UK politics podcast.
Yeah.
As always, we are joined by Ben Blissett, TLDR UK lead.
Yes.
And I'm not Georgina, as you may have noticed. I'm subbing in for Georgina today. She is away, but I'm excited to talk about UK politics.
Yes.
Even though this week is massively overshadowed by everything happening in the US.
We've chosen an interesting week to do a UK podcast.
Yeah, believe it or not, things are still happening in the UK.
They are, very much so.
You know, despite Trump's overbearing sort of the world. In today's episode, we're going to talk mainly about Kemi Badenoch and how she's faring as Tory leader.
Yeah.
What sort of sparked that discussion, Ben?
She did a speech on the 16th of January, and this was meant to be a big sort of, maybe not a reset, but certainly provide some clarity about her leadership. As anybody that's in any way following UK politics will know, the Conservative Party have not really started to recover in the polls since their defeat in the general election last year, a defeat that saw them reduced to the lowest number of seats in their history as a political party. They're also still contending with Reform UK in the polls. Reform UK in a handful of polls have actually exceeded on occasion the Conservative Party. Farage is still a relatively popular figure here in the UK, obviously very polarising, but among certain groups very popular, and has sort of found his footing in UK politics. And in some instances, you can certainly make the argument that he's a better representative of those on the right in the UK than the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch. So there's been a lot of criticism at the minute of Kemi Badenoch, of her sort of inability to really rise to the challenges of leadership. And this speech was sort of meant to put some of those concerns aside, lay out maybe a bit of a path to the Conservatives regaining in popularity, a path of her leadership, what she's planning to do. And if I'm being blunt, I don't think she's done that. So that's sort of what has inspired me to want to talk about that today. Yeah. And that, I think, is going to be our main topic today.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, you know, they are the main opposition party, but they seem to be struggling to be in the headlines as much as obviously the government, but also Reform, like you said. They are really fighting for airtime, which is a big challenge for them.
And just to be clear, I think that's sort of by design. I think Badenoch has become leader, and just to be clear, I want to give her some credit here. I think she's become leader, and the Conservative Party was factionalized, very, very factionalized. After you lose an election by that amount, after you are defeated in one of the most historic defeats in your history as a political party, questions are going to start to arise as to why that happened. Now, immediately after the election, you had those in the centre of the Conservative Party saying, we went too far right, we were playing too much into the culture war stuff, we shouldn't have done that. Those on the right are saying that we didn't go right-wing enough.
Yeah, we were too liberal.
We were too liberal. Reform were able to outmaneuver us on the right. That's why we lost. I think Badenoch, when she first took over, and I think there is a logic in this, was just trying to keep the ship together. Yeah. But we're now many, many months on from the election, and the ship has been held together, and you sort of now need to take that next step of, what do you want this party to be? Because at the minute, whenever the Labour Party does anything, it's Reform UK and it's Nigel Farage that does the most cutting critique that gets then picked up by the media, and that is used almost as the soundbite and the representative opinion of those on the right. Yeah. And I think that's where Badenoch is failing. If we're being totally blunt, the two main things that Badenoch's been in the news for in the last few months is a comment on her sandwich preference and her attacking Reform UK for falsifying their membership numbers, which turned out not to be true. So, you know, if
picked the wrong battles, or just these little weird things have made it to the headlines, which is sort of not what you want.
But when it's things like the farmers' protests, Farage is very good. And I think this is the other thing, is that Farage is quite a nimble political operator and is in a sense, similar to Trump in the US, able to use short form video like TikTok to his advantage to sort of get his message across. And I don't really think that's the case with Badenoch. I don't think she's really managed to catch the media's attention. And as I say, I think this started out as being by design. Yeah. But and for reasons we'll get on to in a minute, I don't think this is a good strategy for the future.
Yeah. So we've mentioned her big speech, the big start of year
Yes.
speech. Um, Viewers can watch through it if they want to, but maybe maybe we shouldn't put them through that. But what's the sort of takeaway
Yeah.
from it? What was she saying?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked. So there's I think there were a few things that she'd sort of said, and I'll bring up some sort of quotes from it. One of the main things is Labour have made mistakes,
Yeah.
and I think
No
that's
surprise
no
there.
surprise
Yeah.
there. But what she's tried to say is that the Conservative Party also made mistakes when they were in government. So one of the quotes that one of the things she said in the speech was that the difference between me and Keir Starmer is that he doesn't believe he's ever made a mistake. I will acknowledge the mistakes that I'll acknowledge the Conservative Party made mistakes. There's been some discussion of this in the media, one by Rachel Cunliffe from the New Statesman, and basically she picked up on like a very small sort of sleight of hand in that quote there. So what she sort of said is that the Keir Starmer doesn't admit that he's ever made mistakes,
Yeah.
but that Kemi will admit the mistakes that the Conservative Party
Yes.
has made. She doesn't at any point acknowledge anything that any mistakes that she's made as part of that Conservative government. And just to be
Collective
clear, she served
responsibility.
in all of the Conservative
Yeah, she's
governments.
had some pretty
and
significant roles. She's
significant
not just an
roles.
outsider who's come in.
Exactly. And then she actually goes on to sort of criticize some of the big policies of former Conservative leaders. So she says, we announced that we'd leave the European Union before we had a plan for growth outside the EU. You know, that's a tacit criticism of both David Cameron, sort of in a sense, Theresa May, and in a sense, Boris Johnson, I suppose. We made it law that we would deliver net zero by 2050, and only then did we start thinking about how we do that. That's obviously a tacit criticism of Theresa May. Then she said, we announced year after year that we would lower immigration, but despite our efforts, immigration kept going up. That's just a criticism of all Tory leaders, because they've all made that promise. So just to be clear, she criticizes Labour and criticises the Conservative Party, but doesn't acknowledge any errors on her part. And I suppose this is the issue with the speech, is that she's also, one of the big points of the speech is that I'm different. This is a Conservative Party under new leadership. I'm going to be honest. Honesty is one of my big policies. I'm going to be honest about our failures, about the Conservatives' failures. That's what we're going to do. But if you're going to do that, you've sort of got to take some accountability. And more importantly, you've got to try and demonstrate how you are going to fix problems. Because on the point of immigration, it's all well and good to talk a big game on lowering immigration and specifically criticising previous Conservative leaders for promising to lower immigration and not doing so.
Yeah.
It's all well and good doing that. But if you don't have a concrete plan for how you're going to do that, or at least some direction you want to go in, or some like firm specific criticism on like immigration policy rather than numbers, then you're doing exactly the same as the people as previous leaders.
This time it doesn't count because I am promising that we'll bring it down.
So I think this was quite a disappointing speech, because it was very much talking about like talking in generalities, talking in general about previous Conservative leaders, while saying I'm going to be different. But all the previous Conservative leaders has made this point that I'm different. I'm going to be different. And just to add on to this as well, it's very clear that she's trying to change her approach to Nigel Farage. So as obviously we previously mentioned, one of the things that she was really in the news for in the last few months was criticising the membership numbers for Reform. And it was a very sort of, I think it came across as almost petty in criticising that. She's now trying to take a more sort of, I don't know, kind isn't really, but more of a trying to demonstrate some respect for Reform and for Farage. And I can understand that. I think that makes sense. In the speech, she sort of, in the Q&A afterwards, she was asked about Farage, and she sort of said some sort of platitude about, you know, he's got a number more years of leadership experience than I do. And so trying to be a bit more sort of, exactly that, sort of trying to show that she's got respect for him. But and in doing so, I think she's trying to push forward that, because her background is an engineer, right? So her background is sort of fixing problems. I think she's trying to advocate this narrative that Farage is good at identifying problems, specifically on things like immigration, and that she, as an engineer, will be someone that will come in and will fix these things. You know, I acknowledge that these people previously have identified problems with the British state. As a prime minister, I would be the person that would come in and fix it. But again, these arguments fall flat if they're completely devoid of
Yeah.
any specifics or any sort of direction. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of people expected this speech to be exactly that, for this to be her first moment to actually show what her Conservative Party would do.
Yeah.
And I think she really failed.
Yeah. And there were reports that she told the cabinet earlier, well, at the start of this year, that they shouldn't really expect any policy announcements until closer to 2027, I think she said.
And then double down on it either, I can't remember, it was either in the speech or in the Q&A.
Yeah. So she, that's not just, she didn't just accidentally forget to mention policies in that speech. It's a strategy. They're trying to go policy light until, a few years close to the election. Which is, I don't know if this is a good comparison to make, but I'm going to try and make it anyway. It sort of reminds me of when Keir Starmer became Labour leader, and his whole thing that whole time was, first we have to change the Labour Party and rebuild trust in the party, and then then we can start to fight the election, as it were. That I don't think that approach necessarily works for Kemi Badenoch, because Labour to some degree could sort out the party first and allow the Conservatives to make mistakes, and that was always just going to benefit Labour. But the Conservatives now can't just let Labour sort of make mistakes because of reform.
Yes,
there's another party that's there to sweep up support as Labour makes mistakes.
I think that's a really good point, and I think that the time in which they're doing it is so different. Labour had that luxury. Labour had the luxury, as you rightly say, of not being squeezed on, in their case on the left, but in the Conservative case on the right, and the fact that there was not sort of the pressure of their polling being too low. The Conservatives have both of that. And I would also just add to that as well, that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party are very different in how they approach their leaders. The Conservative Party are almost defined by regicide, especially after they lose elections. So if you look to the early 2000s, right, after they've been defeated after a long stint in government, after Tony Blair has won a landslide election victory in 1997, they go through three different leaders. You have William Hague, 1997 to 2001. You have Ian Duncan Smith, 2001 to 2003, and you have Michael Howard, 2003 to 2005. They were not happy with the fact that their leaders weren't making more headway in the polls. And Labour seemed to afford their leader a little bit more leeway. I mean, look at Corbyn, for example. He lost the election in 2017. He's given another shot in 2019. I think with the Conservative leader, you'd probably be a little bit different. And if you have a look at how many Labour leaders have been toppled by their own versus Conservatives, I think the numbers are remarkably different.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of that is, it's a lot easier for the Conservative Party to remove its leaders, whereas Labour is a more democratic party, effectively, in how it chooses and replaces its leaders.
A good example here is when Ian Duncan Smith was leader. He'd sort of, Crispin Blunt called for his resignations after the 2003 local elections, and in him calling for that, he said that Smith had failed to make an impact on the electorate. Like, people cite not like turning the ship around as a reason to try and topple leaders. And there's been, as I say, there's been stuff written about this already.
I was going to say there's this polling as well that suggests that Badenoch isn't sort of making a big splash. I know there was a YouGov one about people's preferred prime minister, and we talked about it in the office the other day. But I mean, the headline was Nigel Farage ahead of Keir Starmer by about 1 point. He had 20%, I think.
Yes, yeah.
As you pointed out the other day, it was a big don't know section, so that sort of changes the perception of it. But the point I'm trying to make is that Badenoch was fighting for third place with Ed Davey, I think, in that poll, and that is not a good sign. When
irrespective. And the other thing is, irrespective of whether these polls actually mean anything at this point, the thing is, she's right in saying that we're years and years away from an election. So laying out specific policy is fruitless because we're years and years away. So there's no opportunity for us to be in government and enact any of this yet. I think that's fair to say. And I think it's also fair. I can understand where she's coming from, trying to suggest, we shouldn't get too worried about polls at this point because we're so many years away from an election. There's a lot more to do. But the issue is I think she's too focused on being concerned about power being taken away from her in an election, and she's not focused enough on power being taken away from her by her own
Yeah.
side. I think she's not got, because these things don't matter in an election, but they matter greatly to the Conservative Party and who they want as leader. And history suggests that there is a good chance that if she doesn't start turning these things around, that she could be toppled relatively swiftly.
And we have things like the council elections coming up
Yeah.
that will be a huge sort of indicator of how she's performing. And then Welsh, the Welsh elections, I think next year possibly. That's another one.
Yeah, exactly. Which Reform
Yeah,
are suggested to do
Yeah.
very well in.
Yeah, and it's not like you look at the high profile members of the Conservative Party. Robert Jenrick is the best
Yeah.
example. He's clearly just angling for the right moment to sort of pounce and try and win the leadership, having been beaten by Badenoch in the election last year.
Jenrick's big sell is that he's very right wing, and he's
Yeah.
he hasn't always historically been, but he's trying to show that I've moved further right wing, and if you want a right wing representative of the Conservative Party, I am that person. And as Badenoch was elected with people expecting her to move the Conservative Party further right, but with no policy announcements and with no sort of overarching ideology to the current leadership of the Conservative Party, those that put her in that position, wanting the Conservative Party to be moved right, will start thinking more and more over the coming months, why have we gone with her? Why didn't we go with Jenrick? Because if Jenrick becomes leader, I think, with the way that he's talking at the minute and some of the statements he's made in the last few months, which has definitely sort of garnered controversy, it's clear that he actually would move the Conservative Party more right. So all those people
out Farage.
Yeah, exactly. And all those people that put Badenoch in thinking she would do that, and maybe she does that in 2027. But for those that want her to do that more swiftly, they're going to start looking at Jenrick as an obvious candidate to do so. If I was Badenoch right now, I'd be moving with a lot more haste than she currently is.
Yeah. Well, if she's watching, there's the advice.
Well, there you go. Yeah, she can have that one for free.
Yeah. Okay, so that was Kemi Badenoch and her sort of troubles at the moment. We're going to move on to the next section now, which is our cabinet review section, where we take normally we would take a member of the cabinet and try and see what they're up to.
Yeah.
We're going to cheat slightly and choose someone outside of cabinet. But
2 weeks into the format and we're already breaking it, but that's fine.
They're sort of adjacent to the cabinet, to the UK government. We're going for Peter Mandelson, the former, is he still the Prince of Darkness?
I think once you've been ascribed Prince of Darkness, you're Prince of Darkness for life.
Yeah, so very prominent figure in the sort of New Labour era, and he's sort of had a bit of a resurgence under Keir Starmer. He's been put forward by Keir Starmer as the new UK ambassador to the US, in the hopes that he will be some sort of savvy Trump whisperer type. The reason we're talking about this, because that was actually announced last year. The reason we're talking about this now is because there have been various reports that that the Trump administration might effectively refuse Mandelson's appointment as the ambassador. It's worth saying that I'm not sure there's an actual mechanism for them to refuse that, but they would, given the relationship between the US and UK, I think they would just say behind the scenes to the UK government, we don't want him, choose someone else. The reason why there's this theory that Trump might refuse Mandelson is there's a few angles to it. The main one is that Mandelson is actually seen as a lot more warm to China than Trump would like, given Trump's sort of anti-China positioning. So Mandelson co-founded a advisory firm called Global Counsel, and they've had various Chinese state-owned companies as clients. He's also talked about the importance of engaging with China on like trade policy and things like that, which sort of goes against Trump's tariff approach. So I think there's a view in the Trump world that Mandelson's a bit too China friendly. There's also, I think a slight miscalculation by Starmer, thinking that Peter Mandelson is, he's a political appointment. He's someone with ties to the US that should be able to work with Trump. But it's a very different style, I think.
Yeah.
It might have worked. He might have been in a sort of more, it might have been the right type of person a few decades ago during the New Labour era, but the Trump Republican Party is a very different one to the one 2 decades ago, right? It works in a very different style, and I think that it was a bit of a miscalculation to view Mandelson as someone who could navigate that.
Yeah, I think also presumably behind the scenes, Trump's going to want to push because there's always this discussion, isn't there, about Farage wanting to try
Yeah.
and be the UK's envoy, and I'm aware that this probably isn't a move to try and get him
Mm.
into that position, but I think it's, as you say, it's certainly a move to try and get someone at least maybe not as left wing, or maybe slightly more aligned with the US in certain areas.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think I don't know how much precedent there is for this as well, of the US actually, like, as you said, there's no mechanism for them
Yeah.
to actually deny it, but like, I wonder how much precedent there is historically for them
Yeah.
trying to pressure the UK, because it's the UK's decision who they
Yeah.
send,
But I guess
right?
previously we've always sent career diplomats rather than
Yeah.
political appointments, so there's never really been a reason to
Mm.
deny it. I mean, actually, the UK ambassador to the US before the one that's just
Yeah.
left, Kim Darroch, I think, he obviously he had a massive blow up with Trump and ended up resigning, I think,
Mm.
because he had this public spat with Trump over comments he made about Trump being, I can't remember. I think I want to say I think he said Trump was like the Terminator or something like that.
Right. Okay.
I don't know if that's actually accurate or not. But
Well,
anyway,
it depends what context he says
yes,
it in,
yeah.
you know?
So, but that resulted in him resigning his post, sort of under,
Mm.
maybe not under like direct pressure, but sort of wider pressure from the US government. So there is that side of things. But he, that was getting rid of an existing ambassador rather than just saying no to one that's been appointed.
Yeah.
So maybe it's slightly different. But we'll see if Mandelson does actually get the job or not.
Yeah, but it wouldn't be
and
the
how
most
long he would
explosive
last.
thing the Trump administration has done in its first few days in
No,
office, would it?
yeah, not at all.
But we'll be reporting on it nonetheless.
Yes,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. And I always wonder with this, like, we talk about this as if it's quite a big story. I wonder how much Trump is even
Yeah.
thinking about who the UK ambassador is. But who knows? He could have his eyes on it.
Yeah, well, I can think of one tech bro that probably is.
Yes.
That has a particular fascination with UK politics. But well, yeah, as you say, we'll see what happens, and we'll come back.
Yeah.
On it.
So we'll move on to the sort of final section now. It's going to be a bit looser, with a general theme of the pension triple lock, which has been a story that's, well, the triple lock's been in existence for like a decade now, I think, and it's constantly part of like a battle of, this is grossly unfair versus we've got to keep this, strengthen this is untouchable kind of thing. Once again, it is back in the headlines for a few reasons. Kemi Badenoch, we mentioned earlier, sort of slightly suggested that the Tories were thinking about means testing the triple lock, which firstly doesn't really make sense. Presumably it would be means testing the state pension.
Yes.
And also she didn't say it directly, she sort of implied it, and she sort of said, actually, we weren't saying that, I was talking about means testing more generally, so it wasn't completely clear what she meant. But nevertheless, that made it into the headlines. Then also the former Lib Dem minister who actually sort of signed off on the triple lock back during the coalition era has said that he doesn't think that the triple lock should exist indefinitely. His comments, he did say he thinks it's the right thing for now, but not indefinitely. So that sort of plays into this idea that, like, it's untouchable for now. In the future, sure, but we won't deal with it now. I'm going to give you a very open
much like the thick of it. There's a plot line in there where one of the ministers has to say something like, the right minister for the moment, and they missay it and they say they're the right minister at the moment. And it feels very much like that. But yeah, just to add a third reason that we're going to talk about the triple lock. There's also a petition going around at the minute which has got 20,000 signatures, which isn't a huge amount. It's enough to warrant a government response, but it's not, which is 10,000, but not at the 100,000, which means that there'll be a debate yet. And the petition states that they want to give the state pension to everybody at 60 and increase it to equal 48 hours at the living wage. So yeah, it's calling basically for
it'd be a massive increase
in the state pension.
And about 7 or 8 years early, which would be France tried to reduce it by 2 years, or increase it by 2 years, and cause riots. This would be going the opposite way, but a very dramatic way. So Should we explain what the triple lock is
Yeah.
actually?
So
Or yeah.
yeah. So the triple lock is effectively, everybody. Do you know what age it is that you have to be? Is it 70, 60,
To get
68? Sorry.
I think for people now it's 66 or 67, but I know if I look at my pension it says your presumed
Yes.
retirement age is 68, but we'll
Sorry,
see
yeah. Maybe that's
if
where
that
I'm getting the number
survives.
from, is when
Yeah.
I'm likely going to get it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so anybody that gets to that age will receive money from the government as part of their state pension. To make sure that it doesn't decrease, and the reason it was first introduced is because of a prevalence of pensioner poverty. The government commits that it will increase by one of three different methods. It's either inflation, an average of earnings, or 2.5%, whichever's higher of the three. So the 2.5% there is to make sure that, so if inflation and average earnings are below 2.5%, the state pension will increase at 2.5% regardless.
Yeah.
So this led to, in COVID, I think it increased by definitely double digits. It was like 10 or 11%.
Yeah.
In COVID. So it's quite a generous scheme here in the UK. Now, as I say, the original reason for this being introduced was a prevalence of pensioner poverty, and there's a lot of evidence for this, and it was widely supported at the time. As years have gone on, and obviously as the triple lock has meant that pensions have increased quite starkly when you look at things like inflation and average earnings, questions arise from time to time about the intergenerational fairness of all of this. Because I think, as you point out with the Lib Dem minister there, it's costs the state a lot of money to do this. And I think it's understood by a number of different groups that this policy cannot continue indefinitely, because as more and more people, as the sort of non-working age population, by which I mean sort of retirees, increases as a proportion of those working, more and more pressure is put on the state to be able to pay the state pension. And if it's increasing at that rate, it just at some point will become unsustainable. So there is a significant argument to make that future generations won't get as generous pension support as the current generation, which is why this argument comes up from time to time. Again, it's complicated. Just very quickly, it is complicated because of that pensioner poverty thing 10 years ago, and people worrying that if we don't maintain this, that we'll slowly slide back
into that. And on the intergenerational thing, it's also the fact that when governments say they need to save money and they look at all these things they can cut, whether it's benefits or increasing student loans, or all these things on what I guess are younger people or working people. While the triple lock has sort of been untouchable, it's that perception that why can't you go after another group of people?
Yeah, and I think this is the thing, is that in the last few years, obviously, this country's gone through, and countries all over the world have gone through, a significant sort of cost of living crisis, and governments have gone, to use your phrase, sort of gone after different groups in different ways, whether that be, increases in VAT, in income tax, in employment, national insurance contributions. There's lots of different ways. There's the Farmers with Inheritance Act. There's lots of different ways that people are targeted, and the student loan repayment threshold not rising. But as you say, the fact that there is literally one part of the state that is so protected, each year that continues, more and more attention is drawn to it. And I understand that there are groups that think it's not generous enough, and that they were promised this for a certain period, and that they've paid into the system and everything. But at times there are questions of, if we're going through extraordinarily difficult financial times, there's a perception that everybody should be chipping in, and everybody should share the pain equally.
The argument about we've paid into this and we were promised this doesn't really fly, because it's not, the state pension isn't a pot that you pay into that you can then reclaim. It's effectively paid for by taxation now. It's at the time, and also it's not a promise. You're not promised aged 20 that you'll get this amount from this age. It changes over time. We know that.
So just very quickly, and I suppose it's just a point that we can both sort of get into. Do you think this is something that the current government is going to look at and change?
I don't. It's hard to say, because I think that the vibe around it has definitely changed, in that there seems to be a building consensus that actually something needs to be done, and I think the taboo has slightly been broken. But then we get to the thing of, that might be the case, but is the current government going to do something?
Mm.
I don't know. I don't think the current government will. But then we just get into the whole thing of, that it will happen, but just now's not the time. And that something has to come to a head at some point. But I suppose if Labour get really desperate and need to sort of find a way of sort of raising funds, then that could be an option, or saving money. But I wonder how much they've been stung by the winter fuel allowance
Yeah.
thing.
I think you're right. I think it's something that it's becoming clear that it has to change at some point. And I think we're going to get to a point where everybody agrees that it will change at some point.
Yeah.
But just and it's the same with the Lib Dem person you raised earlier. That I think that is going to be the language often used about it, is that we all accept that this is going to change at some point. We just, none of us, nobody wants to be the person that does that.
But it's not like a government is going to come in and completely scrap it. All the talk of how they would change it is effectively just probably turning it into like a double lock, getting rid of the 2.5% thing, or making it an average of earnings and inflation, something like that. There are lots of ways of doing it without just condemning it entirely to the bin. But yeah, so you think maybe not this government?
I don't think this one. I think if the Conservatives commit to, again, it wouldn't actually be the triple lock, it would be the eligibility for the state pension, which would be, actually quite significantly different, but still related to pensions. I think if they commit to that, it then makes it slightly easier for Labour, because it weakens the attack from the Conservatives. But I'm sceptical that Badenoch will commit to that, and I am also sceptical that Labour will do anything. I think it'll be pushed and pushed and pushed down the road until we get to an actual breaking point, at which point whoever's in at the time, it will just have to say, look, it has gotten way, way too expensive now. We have to do something. And they'll justify that by saying, look at how much we are spending. It is, what else can we do than literally changing this at this moment, until the point, it balloons up to taking up like unsustainable amounts of money at the moment. I don't think anything's really going to change. I think it's very much like other problems such as road pricing, where we all know something needs to be done, but
not
we're
now.
just going to kick it down the road.
Yeah. So the pension lock, the triple lock survives for now.
That's our prediction.
Yes.
And given how correct we've been with predictions in the past, it means that there's probably
tomorrow
days
they'll
before
announce
they
that it's gone. Yeah,
exactly.
Well, I think that just about sums everything up that we wanted to talk about. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. Who knows what we'll be talking about? We could be in a trade war with the US. Peter Mandelson could be in or out. Who knows?
Yeah. Triple lock could be axed.
Yeah. Exciting
Badenoch
times.
could be gone.
Yeah.
Who knows?
So stick around for that, and subscribe, comment, like all the good stuff.
All the good stuff.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Rory.
Thanks for coming on the show.
What a
and
lovely
thank you for
awkward
watching.
end.